Koutou everyone, thank you very much for joining this session today. I'm the Chief Scientist with the Commission, been here since we were set up in 2019. I'm just going to give a couple of, I think there's 2 slides, just a little bit of sort of high-level introduction to the Commission and our role around adaptation, and then hand over to Karen and the team for all the exciting stuff that you're here to hear about. So if I could have the next slide there, thanks, Kushbu. All right. So the Climate Change Commission, Hapoarangi, we were established in 2019 as part of a series of amendments to the Climate Change Response Act. So as well as establishing the commission that set the 2050 domestic target, requirement for emissions budgets, and the requirement for a national risk assessment, which we're going to talk about today, and some other pieces of work that we're required to deliver. So our job is to provide independent, impartial, evidence-based advice to the government of the day on climate-related issues, and that's both emissions reduction and adaptation. The advice that we give and the things that we are required to consider in that advice are set out in the Climate Change Response Act, and it was Parliament's intention when the amendments were made that we would consider a wide range of factors to try and give the most helpful, useful advice for the government to be able to take action. We don't develop policy. We give high-level advice around the direction of travel, and it is up to the government of the day and their ministries to actually set the policies and the actions that follow. Our recommendations aren't binding on the government. They form part of the advice that the government considers when they then carry out their functions under the Act. And our work to date over the previous 5 years has been very much focused on emissions reduction. So now we are stepping more into our role around adaptation with this work on the risk assessment. Next slide, please, Kushbu. So just a little bit about where we sort of sit in that adaptation landscape. So every 6 years, the Commission will carry out the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. The Ministry for the Environment carried the first assessment, carried that out a couple of years ago, and this is the first time the Commission will do it, and then we will do them each subsequent 6 years. So the purpose of the risk assessment is to set out the climate-related risks to the economy, to our society and our environment, and to really identify the priority areas for the government to focus upon. Our focus is at the national level, the work that we're doing, although of course climate change is inherently local, as many of you will know, I'm sure. It's where the impacts are felt, and it's where actions are actually taken to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So based on the National Risk Assessment, the government then sets out the National Adaptation Plan, and from that flow the policies and the actions that the government and central government, local government, other parties will take. Our monitoring role then steps in. So every 2 years, then we produce a monitoring report on the assessment against the National Adaptation Plan, and that's where we can make recommendations around changes or improvement. And then every 6 years, we will then update the risk assessment, see what might have changed, whether there might be different areas the government should prioritise. With that whistle-stop tour, I'll hand over to Karen, who will lead you through the approach that we're taking to the risk assessment. Karen.
Thanks, Grant. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the introduction, Bevan. Ko Karen Levin tokounga. I'm the Project Director for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. I'm going to start out by just going a little bit deeper on what Grant talked about as to what the National Climate Change Risk Assessment is. So Kushbu, can we please move to the next slide? Thank you. So the Climate Change Response Act outlines 2 important pieces to the risk assessment. The first is assessing risks to New Zealand's economy, society, environment and ecology. So that gives you the sense that this is a systematic risk assessment, and it will be of about 40 to 50 risks. And the second piece there is identifying the most significant risks, their severity and the need for a coordinated response to those risks in the next 6-year period. So while this is a systematic assessment, ultimately to be most helpful, the risk assessment is about prioritisation. It's about identifying what action to take first and then informing that, putting that information through to the government's National Adaptation Plan. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we're defining risk, we're using the internationally accepted definition by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the IPCC defines climate risk as the interaction between climate-related hazards and our exposure and vulnerability to those hazards. And here you can see on the right, vulnerability encompasses both sensitivity or susceptibility to harm and the capacity to cope and adapt. Next slide, please. So the general method that we'll be following for the risk assessment is a pretty typical climate risk assessment method. And just to be clear from the very outset, when we're talking about risks, we're referring to both upside risks and downside risks. So this includes opportunities. We're looking to carry out the risk assessment in 3 broad phases. The first is identifying risks. The second is building the evidence base for each of those risks. And then the third is assessing and prioritising risks. We're particularly conscious of not spending too long in that identification phase, and this is based on conversations we've been having internationally. As what can happen is that can come at the expense of the prioritisation, which, as we've said, is really important for informing the government's National Adaptation Plan. Ultimately, the risk assessment will be a qualitative risk assessment as we're comparing very different things. So just to give an example, some of the risks will be to the natural environment, others may be risks to the economy and financial system. The risk assessment will be underpinned by quantitative information where it's available. Finally, it's very typical to have expert involvement in assessing and prioritising risks, and we're looking to establish technical expert groups to support us in this process. And there's a couple of things that we will be looking for those technical expert groups to be involved in. The first is reviewing the evidence base to ensure that we've considered the breadth of information that's available and that we're portraying the evidence accurately and in a balanced way. And the second is supporting us in testing our assessment. Next slide, please. So we'll be assessing about 40 to 50 risks across 7 different areas. And the purpose of splitting risks into these different areas is to make sure that we identify the range of risks that we need to be assessing, and also to help make the risk assessment manageable. These 7 areas are not supposed to be limiting. They're supposed to support a holistic view, and as such, the areas aren't mutually exclusive. Ultimately, when we go through the risk assessment, each risk gets assessed in turn, whether it relates to one or more of these areas. For those of you that are familiar with the first risk assessment that was done in 2020, you'll notice a few changes to this domain breakdown. These areas build on the domains in that first risk assessment, but there are 2 additions. So the first is Ngā mea hira o te ao Māori, which means aspects of importance to te ao Māori. It was originally intended that there be a Māori domain in that first risk assessment, but that didn't eventuate. And so we're providing a dedicated space here, as well as integrating it across the wider risk assessment work. The second addition here is sectors relying on the natural environment. So in this risk assessment, we've split that out from the economy area and providing a dedicated space for elements like the primary industries and tourism. Next slide, please. So evidence to assess each risk will come in a range of forms and from a range of sources. So our team internally will be carrying out desktop research. There'll be information that you and others share through the call for evidence, which closes at the end of the month. We will be carrying out a lot of engagement, including in this webinar. So please feel free to share any evidence that you have in the chat, and we will be monitoring that. I mentioned the technical expert groups. They will provide information to us as well and help us ensure that we're looking at the breadth of information that we need to be looking at. Case studies and regional engagement. They will help to provide localised insights into our work. We're also doing some work to improve our understanding of cascading risks. And then also there are some small areas where we're investing to improve the evidence base. Next slide, please. So once we've built up the evidence for each of the risks, we'll then move on to the assessment and prioritisation. And there's two really important factors that we will consider in the risk assessment. So these are risk severity and policy readiness. Both of those components are really important for determining what needs to be prioritised for action in the 6 years following the delivery of this risk assessment. Action in the next 6 years that could be needed to address a very immediate risk, but equally so, it might be needed to address a less immediate risk, but that risk might have a very long lead time or need early action so that we avoid maladaptation or irreversible consequences. To understand risk severity, there are a few different aspects that we'll be looking at. So we'll be looking to understand the consequence of the risk in different time periods and under different scenarios. That will specifically include us looking at the hazard exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity. We'll look at how a risk may compound and cascade. We'll look at whether the risk varies region to region, whether it has significant impacts for iwi Māori, if there is potential lock-in risks or loss of opportunities, particularly in the coming 6 years. And then we'll also look at a range of climate and non-climate aspects that may exacerbate or reduce the risk. So, for example, thresholds and tipping points, socioeconomic trends that may make a risk worse, or climate mitigation action. To understand the policy readiness side of this equation, we'll be looking at what actions can be taken to address the risk, the potential impacts of those actions on future risk, and the lead-in time for those actions. We'll be looking at what action is being taken already to address the risk and the impact that it's having, whether any actions have or could lead to maladaptation or lock-in, whether there are any barriers delaying action to address risk, and ultimately, we'll be looking to understand whether there is a shortfall in planned adaptation, because that will give us a sense of what further is needed. Next slide, please, Kushbu. So I'll move on to the next section now, but just a reminder to put any questions you have on the approach into the Q&A tab. Next slide, please, and next one again. Thanks, Kushbu. So I'm now going to talk you through the process for building the list of risks that we are looking at, and then I'll briefly go through that list with you. So the process we're taking is building off the first risk assessment released in 2020. So we mentioned earlier that we're particularly conscious of not spending too long in the identification phase, as that can come at the expense of that prioritisation, which is the ultimate goal of the risk assessment. So we've received a lot of feedback on the first risk assessment, which suggested that generally the risk list in that worked well. However, it is clear that it could be improved in a few key areas. So just to name some of those areas, improving the consideration of risks to Māori interests and investments, health and wellbeing, culture and practices. Refining the list of risks to the natural environment to make sure they're all at a similar level. Giving the primary industries more attention, as risks to agriculture, horticulture and forestry all sat within one risk in the first risk assessment, and they make up a big part of our economy. Including risks to telecommunications, which wasn't included in the first risk assessment, and incorporating cascading risks more. In that process of making amendments, we need to keep in mind that risks need to have a similar level of aggregation, as varying levels of aggregation can bias the assessment. So just to give you an example, if we were comparing a risk to a particular bird species to a much broader risk to the economy, that would likely end up in a bias towards the economy risk. The other thing that we're keeping in mind as we develop the risk list is that risk statements are framed using element-based framing, which is risk to something from something. And so this is not what a lot of us would think of when we think of a risk, not a risk from a particular hazard. Next slide, please. So now just stepping through the risks that are included in the risk assessment. So looking first at the natural environment, we're looking at risk to the coastal, marine, freshwater and terrestrial systems, and also to Indigenous biodiversity. For the built environment, we're looking at risk to buildings, urban spaces and infrastructure. We're also looking at risk to connected infrastructure networks, and I want to point that one out specifically. So that includes those cascading failures that we often see because infrastructure is so interconnected, and that was very obvious through Cyclone Gabriel. In the people, health and community space, the risks here are really about people's identity, health, sense of community and social norms, and cultural values and traditions. Next slide, please. So moving on to sectors relying on the natural environment. So that includes risks to livestock, agriculture, horticulture, forestry, fisheries, tourism, and renewable energy generation. For economy and financial system, so that looks at risks to economic production, which might flow from the risks I just mentioned in those sectors above. Risks to the financial system, insurability of assets, and to governments from economic costs. Next slide, please. And for the last two domains, so risks for the Ngā Mea Aotearoa Māori domain, we're still determining these, but they include risks to Māori interests and investments, health and wellbeing, and culture and practices. And for the governance domain, so these are the risks that relate to our governing architecture and the processes of interaction and decision-making that exist in and between governments, economic and social institutions. So these risks really relate to our ability to make decisions. Next slide, please. So just another reminder, before I move on to the next section, if you've got any questions or feedback on the risk list, please put them in the Q&A box now, and we can answer those shortly. And I'll just move on to next steps. Next slide, please. And the next one again. Thank you. So in terms of next steps and how you can be involved, so the 2026 risk assessment is due no later than the 3rd of August 2026, and we're very much in the evidence building phase at the moment, and we will be until about July or August this year. We currently have a call for evidence open, and that will be closing at the end of the month. So please share any evidence that you think we should be looking at, and preferably please share them as PDFs so that we are able to easily access that information. We'll also be having early conversations as we build up the evidence base, so you may well hear from us and looking to learn from your experience. I mentioned earlier that we'll be setting up technical expert groups. We haven't fully designed those groups up. That will be something that will start next month. But the purpose of those expert groups is to ensure that the evidence base is balanced and reflective of current knowledge. And also that to make sure that our assessment is rigorous and fair, based on the expert judgment of people with significant experience working in and across the domain areas. Finally, the best place to stay up to date on progress is by signing up to our newsletter, and we'll get someone to place this link in the chat for you so that you can access it. Moving on to the next slide, please. And so that concludes our slides. If you have any questions on the next steps or how you can be involved, please also put them in the Q&A box, and I'll hand back to Bevan for questions.
Oh, tēnā koe, Karen. Thank you very much. So yeah, as Karen's just said, this is our question time. So we've got Chris and we've got Emma that will also support. We've got Grant Blackwell, our chief scientist. So here is our first question. Communities are one of the key sectors being impacted. Clearly, they are also part of the economy. What are your ideas about including representative communities?
Yeah, I can talk to this one, Bevan. So the interesting thing about the risk assessment is that it is a national level risk assessment that we're carrying out, but we're very conscious that adaptation is inherently a local issue. So there's a couple of things that we're doing to make sure that we're getting the localised insights into our assessment. One of them is carrying out case studies. So this is a piece of work that we started a couple of years ago. To date, we've carried out case studies in Wairoa, South Dunedin, and we actually just had one last week in Northland that Grant was on, so might be able to provide some insights onto that. We also engage a lot with local government, and so that's a really important insight into some of the localised issues that are being faced as well. Grant, I don't know if you want to share anything about the risk assessment experience last week.
Thanks, Karen, putting me on the spot there. Yes. So several of us were up in Te Tautokoro last week. We met with communities from Whangarei up to Kaitaia. So we met with farmers and growers. We met with hapu. We met with councils, trying to just really understand the experiences that they are having up there. Of course, they've had the impact of the cyclones recently, but seeing some real impacts playing out right now. So we were hearing about farmers selling off their frost equipment because they don't actually need it anymore. They haven't had a frost for sort of 8 or 10 years or more. So also hearing about opportunities people are seeing, but the needs that they have to be able to support taking on those opportunities. So we heard calls around infrastructure. We some comments around just clarity around roles. So what is the central government's role? What are council's roles? What role do communities play? So some really valuable insights from that feed into our thinking, both for the risk assessment, but also for the monitoring work around the adaptation plan. And if there are things there that the current settings are, there could be areas for refinement or improvement. So they're really valuable for us to get out there and get on the ground, actually hearing directly from communities about the impacts they're seeing and the challenges and barriers that they're facing. So they're a real valuable part of the process. But Karen, there was probably more you were going to add on other ways that we are drawing in communities.
Yeah, I guess the one other thing to mention is the call for evidence, and we're encouraging that across the country for anyone to input any information into that. One of the things in the call for evidence process is that we do have some functionality where you can indicate where your evidence relates to. So we're not just looking for peer-reviewed research articles. We're looking for a range of evidence that might include Ngā Tauranga Māori, it might include community experiences. Any of those things are all valid information for us.
Okay, we got question 2. Is there a practical reason for not moving to the 4-dimension of risk framework, i.e. adding response to hazard, exposure and vulnerability?
So I can take that one. So as Karen mentioned earlier, there are 2 main components to our assessment of risk. So the first of those is risk severity, which covers those elements of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And the second is policy readiness. So that's where that response element comes in. So that assessment is looking at the actions that are currently being undertaken to address the risks and how far those actions go in terms of being sufficient to address and manage those risks. So it essentially does include response. We've just framed it a little bit differently.
And question 3. Hi, Karen and team. Will you be using the last IPCC modelling views? And there's a reference, Mine Shoson et al. 2024, that are moving away from the high-end climate scenarios for projecting future climate risks.
I can do that one as well. I will just take a step back and talk about the scenarios that we are using because we haven't actually gone through those in detail yet. And I'll note up front that in deciding which scenarios to use from an adaptation perspective, the most important thing for us to consider is the climate impact of these scenarios. So bringing the focus away from emissions a little bit. So we have chosen to use two scenarios that equate to low and high levels of warming. So these are 1.5 degrees Celsius and around 2 to 2.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century, and then 2 degrees Celsius and 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So these levels of warming are consistent with low and high emissions pathways such as SSP1 2.6 and SSP3 7.0. And we're also going to be considering thresholds and tipping points as part of our assessment. But I will just note that the rationale for including low and high levels of warming in a risk assessment is to be able to stress test. So we want to make sure that we understand the full range of impact and the full range of risk that we could experience. And we also want to understand how sensitive the risks are to differences in future warming. So it's really important to look at both a low and a high scenario from that perspective. In terms of our prioritization, some risks might be more sensitive to changes in the scenario, and that's something that we want to know about so that we're prepared for all eventualities. So that's why we are making sure that we also consider a high emission scenario.
Kia ora, Emma. Does the Commission have a date at which it plans to finalise the risk identification before moving on to prioritisation? And will it make a long list public at the time?
Kia ora, I can answer that one. So in terms of the risk identification process, it is something that that should be completed in the next few months. I don't have an exact date for that. We're really keen to make sure that we get a lot of our engagement completed so that we can be testing that through that phase, and it does depend somewhat on people's availability and our ability to get conversations in with the range of people that we're really keen to chat to. In terms of the final risk list, we're being very open with the risk list and how it's evolving even in its draft form. So yeah, very happy to make that available when it's finalised as well.
Kia ora, Karen. What is the scope for your assessment? National, but what spatial scale, for example, the South Pacific?
Yeah, I might take that one, Bevan. So kia ora koutou, I'm Chris Holland. Yeah, this is primarily around kind of the impacts which are happening in New Zealand. But for some of those risks, we understand that there are going to be changes happening outside New Zealand's borders and outside its economic zone, which are also going to feed through into the impacts which we see and the risks that we will see in New Zealand. So particularly we've heard through stakeholder engagement around some of the supply chains. So if there are climate events happening overseas that might affect the supply of goods and materials and imports into the country, and also could affect New Zealand's ability to export goods overseas. But also thinking around kind of regional stability, some of those risks might feed through into some of the governance risks that we're having. So yeah, primarily it's going to be a domestic, but we will have to think about looking to think about how changes overseas will impact us here.
Thank you, Chris. What can we do to help ensure we don't double up with evidence collection by the Commission? For example, presumably all the relevant National Science Challenge work.
Yes, so we're very engaged with the work that's been happening as part of the National Science Challenges, which have come to an end. In a lot of those cases, the research that has come out of those projects has been stored in databases, which means that we're able to access that information. As part of the call for evidence work, we're just looking into making evidence available back out to those who have shared it. There is just one aspect to that around ensuring confidentiality and Māori data sovereignty as part of that. But it's very, very normal for the Commission to share back the evidence that has been shared with us. And we'll look to do that in as useful a format as we possibly can as well.
Yeah, there's another part to that question. For more sensitive information, can we be assured that this will only be used by the Commission for the assessment and not be put into the public domain?
Yes, so when you submit under the call for evidence, there is certain privacy clauses within that you'll need to have a read of and check what applies for you. So so check out that information. I think the other thing you can do is get in contact with us directly and have a conversation about that as well.
Can you share who the proposed experts are, or have they yet to be determined?
I might take that one. Can I just check, Bevan, you can hear me? Okay.
I can.
Not normally a problem. Okay.
You were a little bit quiet on the last one, but I can hear you. All good.
Brilliant. Yeah, so we're not at that stage with those technical reference groups of determining who will be on them. As Karen said, we're really at the kind of early stages of planning it. And I suppose we're making some decisions around the form of those groups and then who might be involved and how they might work. But I think we're looking to have a broad range of areas covered and experience. And as Karen said, the role of those groups will really be to test the assessment that we've come up with, to make sure that we've accurately reflected the evidence which we've seen and that the conclusions we're drawing are appropriate. And then those expert groups we're hoping will help us with the prioritization and test some of that. But you know, until we work through the exact details of how those groups will work, that will determine how those groups will meet and who might be involved. And so definitely more work to come in that area over the next few months.
Thank you, Chris. Please tell us what outcomes, in brackets, policies, actions, might have been derived from the last NCCRA.
So I can answer that one, Bevan. So so just to clarify, the Commission didn't complete the first National Climate Change Risk Assessment. That was done by the Ministry for the Environment, and they got a consortium of people to deliver that for them. And so the other aspect to this is that the government's National Adaptation Plan, that is produced by the government, not the independent commission. And so that's where you can look to have a look at the policies and proposals that are contained in that as to what the government is seeking to achieve. When you look at that document, you'll also see that that references that first National Climate Change Risk Assessment, and that is because of the process Grant talked about at the start of the webinar, that the purpose is for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment to inform that National Adaptation Plan. I think with the Commission's role monitoring progress of the National Adaptation Plan, one of the things we did find in our work that we released in August last year was that there could be improvements in how the National Climate Change Risk Assessment feeds in to the National Adaptation Plan. And that's why it's really important for us in this process to focus on prioritisation and making sure we're making it really clear where to put the priority first.
Thanks, Karen. Will you be engaging an urban planner in your expert group?
Yeah, I think we want to be having representation across all those domains, but we haven't determined exactly kind of what skills yet. But it's a good suggestion. I think we want to be making sure that we're covering all those areas and kind of building on the kind of depth of expertise which is out there.
Kia ora, Chris. Does the inclusion of transport networks under the built environment include ferries, ports, rail and air traffic and the systems infrastructure that support them?
Yes, I can answer that one. Yes, absolutely it does. So some of the specific risks in there include to road and rail, to ferry, to ports and airports as part of that. So that is included.
So is it up to central government to implement the NCCRA or is it the local government?
So this one again. So again, this goes back to what is in the Climate Change Response Act, which is that the key purpose of the National Climate Change Risk Assessment is to inform the government's National Adaptation Plan. So ultimately it's about that. Of course, in terms of the policies and proposals and the actions that are taken, there are many people that have a role in adaptation, not just central and local government, but also businesses, communities, individuals, iwi hapu all have roles in that. So I think the National Climate Change Risk Assessment will be relevant for many people, and as well as the government's National Adaptation Plan.
Do climate change adaptation actions clash with New Zealand's emissions reduction plan?
Yeah, I think we're approaching it that we need to be giving advice on both adaptation and emissions reduction. But we are thinking, when we look at the adaptation risks around the changes that we're going to be making in order to reduce emissions, what those could be, and whether those changes mean that the risks change over time for New Zealand. So an example of that might be if we're planting lots of forests in order to sequester carbon, does that affect the impact of wildfires or the risk of wildfires? If we transition to electric vehicles and greater use of electricity for heating homes, what does that do to the resilience? If there are disruptions to the electricity network, what's the consequence of that? So we are thinking about how there's an interaction between the changes that we make for mitigation and how that feeds through into the risks we face adapting to climate change. But we're really seeing it as we need to be taking action on both to reduce our emissions, but also to adapt to the climate change that we know is going to come.
Are you interested in just at this stage, or at risk at this stage, or also the consequences of the risks? Yeah, I'll read it again. Are you interested in just risk at this stage, or also the consequences of that risk? Sorry.
Yes, so we are interested in the consequences of the risk as well. Essentially, our assessment of risk severity, which is where we're looking at those elements of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, as well as some of the other elements that Karen mentioned, is going to inform an assessment of consequence for each risk. So that's kind of the output that we'll get to, is a consequence rating for each of the risks. We haven't fully worked through this process yet, or what the scoring might look like, but we are definitely interested in assessing consequence.
Tēnā koe. I see here it's saying, Chris, that you were too quiet, and we need to acknowledge that you need another run at that question. So that might come up in a little while. Or did you want to cover that now?
Yeah, I think the question was around like the scope of the risk assessment. And apologies that I was quiet there. So yeah, the scope of the risk assessment is really around the risks to New Zealand, but that's mainly focused on the risks which are going to happen in New Zealand itself. But I was saying some of the feedback we've got from some of the engagements we've had is that we've got to think about the changes which are going to happen overseas and how that could affect particularly things like supply chains for New Zealand, the markets we sell into, and access to ports and infrastructure overseas, but also the supply chain of goods and materials that we need coming into New Zealand, and how that could be affected by those. While that really is the focus is going to be domestic, we do need to think about how those could have an effect, particularly on our economy and our resilience that way.
Have there been any further discussions at the central level on how adaptation would be financed? For example, Finance and Expenditure Committee report didn't seem to have any clarity around that.
Yes, yeah, I can answer that one. So in terms of where the Commission sits in this, we're independent of government, so we're not involved directly in those conversations. As I mentioned earlier, we have put out a report monitoring progress of the government's National Adaptation Plan. And within that, we do acknowledge the importance of working through how to fund and finance adaptation. We don't go into detail in terms of policy, and that's because the specific specific policies is the role of government, but we do identify where there are areas that action is needed, and finance is certainly one of those. You might be interested to go and look at that National Adaptation Plan Progress Assessment that was released in August 2024 and will be available on our website.
Kia ora,
I might just, Bevan, if I could just jump in very quickly on that one. Just one of the points to note that we made in that monitoring report was to central government was to clarify roles of central and local government. Certainly something we heard in Northland last week, where councils are looking to act, but trying to work through what the mandate actually is. So that's a very clear thing that we've also recommended, that clarifying who's responsible for what and how central and local government interact and work together in a complementary way is something that we've certainly identified and given advice around.
Kia ora, thanks, Grant. Could you please explain the rationale for the high emissions scenario?
Yes, so I just want to be clear that we are not using the IPCC's SSP5 like 8.5. So we are using a scenario that is more consistent with SSP 3.7.0 for our higher scenario. And as I said before, we are using this scenario in order to stress test risks, and we are using it from an impact perspective, not an emissions perspective. So something that we do have to consider is tipping points and thresholds being crossed that mean that impacts, could be more severe than scenarios might suggest. So that's something that we want to keep in mind as well. So that is why we are still using a high scenario, but to be clear, we are not using the SSP5 8.5 scenario.
Kia ora. Karen Levin, great opportunity to talk about case studies, engagement more broadly, recomposition of these groups. There are some good adaptation experiences and processes going on. For example, South Dunedin's community process, the Regenerate Christchurch process with the Christchurch earthquakes. Would you consider some of these experienced people in these groups? There are currently some very good and much less good processes running.
Well, thanks, Bevan. And so I think this is referring to the technical expert groups, and agree. And we've just seen some work come out of South Dunedin Futures in the last week or so on the processes and options moving forward there. So I think in terms of the technical expert groups, we aren't just necessarily looking at academics and researchers. We're looking for broader people with experience in these areas. So absolutely welcome that. The other point that I would make there is we're very keen to engage more widely outside of those technical expert groups. So the expert groups, there are a lot of people working in this space. We won't be able to have everyone on those groups. So we're very keen to have conversations outside of that as well and make sure that we're getting the range of information that's out there into our assessment.
Kia ora, Karen. Look, I just need to acknowledge that we've had about 60 questions come through. We'll get through as many as we can in this session, and it's great to have this level of interest in our work. So tēnā koutou. Here's our next question. You touched on broadly that you will be taking a qualitative approach to assessing the risks due to the differences in types of risk and information. Will you share your methodology or framework for this part of the assessment?
Kia ora, I can answer that question as well. So we're still actually in the process of writing up our method, and we're still in the process of developing the very final part of the method, which will be a piece that's done later in the year. I guess if you're interested in broadly what that looks like in the meantime, you can have a look at the risk assessment framework that was done in 2020 for the first risk assessment. There will be similarities in what we do here to what was done in that first risk assessment. The other The other places that we're looking is internationally on this. So if you're interested in different approaches, it's also worth looking at the UK Committee on Climate Change, who is now up to their 4th risk assessment for the UK. And another one of interest might be the Australian risk assessment, which is now underway and is not dissimilar to how we run risk assessments in New Zealand. And potentially also, if you're looking even broader, you could look at the Europe risk assessment, which was released about a year ago as well.
How does our progress on climate adaptation compare to other countries, and what else are we learning from them?
Yeah, I can speak to this one as well, and I don't know if I can comment too much on how our progress compares to other countries because we haven't expressly looked at that. But we have learned a lot from other countries, and so just speaking specifically for this climate risk assessment process, we have had a lot of engagement with international experts who have been involved in risk assessments around the world. We've chatted to local government and the experts in local government who have been involved in regional and territorial risk assessments as well. And there's a lot that we can learn from that. And some of that is what you see reflected in our method. The particular one we talked about is one of the routine things we talk about with international experts is the importance of prioritisation, and why, being at the end of the process, it can often not get done as well. And it's really what the risk assessment is all about. And so that's really come through into how we're carrying out our method to make sure we put a lot of emphasis in that part of the process.
Oh, kia ora, Karen. In undertaking the National Risk Assessment, are you using or commissioning any tools, for example, spatial analysis tools to determine risk and consequence from climate hazards?
I can speak a little bit to that one. So the risk assessment ultimately is about us drawing in the information that's already available and using that to understand risks. In some situations, we will look to go in more detail than that, but it's with the breadth of what we're looking at, it is not time-wise and resource-wise is not something that we can really go to that depth as part of it. There are a few areas where we're looking to invest to improve evidence. One of those areas is on cascading risks. So we're specifically looking to see if we can map the cascading risks from infrastructure into dependencies, and also risks to the agriculture sector from drought and how that flows through to impact the economy and people's livelihoods. We've also got some work underway looking at groundwater and salinisation, which we're hoping to progress with. Last year we did some work on exposure to coastal flooding and risk of isolation, communities being cut off from important services. We're looking to expand that if we can, improve work that we've been doing on social vulnerability as part of that as well. So they're just a few areas. There are a number of areas that we're looking to improve on if we can.
Ka pai. Do you have or are you using a social vulnerability assessment that holistically considered indicators? Such a framework would have use beyond this risk assessment for local government and others.
Yeah, I can talk to that one as well. So actually, as part of work that we did last year, we did commission some work from EHINZ, which sits within Massey University, and that was looking at social vulnerability indicators. That's available on our website. And also we talk about that work in Chapter 10 of our National Adaptation Plan Progress Assessment work. So I encourage you to have a look at that. I think one of the areas that's less well understood in the climate adaptation space is that vulnerability end of the equation. It's a lot easier to understand exposure. Sensitivity is still a bit complex, but really understanding that social vulnerability aspect is a very hard one. And so where possible, ultimately that's about people. And so we want to understand that as much as we possibly can. So it's a really important area when we're thinking about where to invest in our work.
Thank you. Regarding evidence gathering, will you accept novel attribution techniques such as those used by the World Weather Attribution Service, or be more interested in more traditional means of attribution?
I can answer that one as well. So I think we're open to all techniques, and we'll have a look at those. In terms of attribution and how it comes into this work, ultimately this work is about looking at projections and how those projections could then play out in a high and low emissions scenario. So how much attribution actually comes into this, I think there's still a question around that, but when it comes to evidence, we're open to all evidence.
Ka pai. It sounds like there is a change in methodology with inclusion of new value domains and consideration of different scenarios, which is a departure from the NCCRA framework and the guidance for local regional climate change risk assessments. Does this mean that the framework and guidance will be updated?
Yeah, I can speak to that one as well. And Emma, feel free to jump in if you want to add anything on that. So yes, there are a couple of new domains, and we're looking at different scenarios. So the Commission does routinely make its methods available, and so that will be part of our process. In terms of the guidance, so I take it you're referring to the guidance that the Ministry for the Environment puts out for local government carrying out risk assessments. So that's not something that the Commission owns, and so that's not our decision as to whether that gets updated or not. Regardless, you will have access to our method and framework, and we will be very clear on why we've made certain decisions as part of that as well. So you'll have that information.
Did you have something to add, Emma? Or you got?
I can just note that the first National Climate Change Risk Assessment did also consider two scenarios, not in the first pass risk screening, but for subsequent phases, they considered RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. So having two scenarios is consistent with that approach.
Kia ora, Emma. This is a question about the relationship with vulnerable communities. Have you considered how the language and approach used in risk assessments might stigmatise certain communities and locations that are perceived to be at the highest risk from climate change?
Yeah, I can talk to that one as well. And I think there's a really tricky thing here in the use of the term vulnerability. And that is a internationally accepted term that's used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's where that term comes from. I think we've specifically thought about the term vulnerable and what that means. We often see that some groups who might be considered to be the most vulnerable are actually very resilient, and so acknowledge that terminology it definitely needs some work. We're very open to any input that people have on that. Any work people have done on communicating some of these ideas with communities.
It looks like we've probably got time for perhaps one more question. Will you quantify the costs of inaction versus adaptation and assess fiscal risks to government, including local government, communities, and different sectors, as several other countries have done?
Yeah, I might take that one. So we're definitely looking at the fiscal risk to government and to local government as one of those risks on the economic and financial domain. But we're also thinking about the potential costs to the broader economy and output from climate change and the disruptions that could cause. I think that might be slightly different from thinking about the kind of costs in action more generally. But we will be looking at the evidence which is available and to see what kind of conclusions can be drawn about about the impact on both government and the broader economy of climate impacts.
Thank you, tēnā koe, Chris. Look, thank you to all of our presenters. That's all we've got time for today.